They said I ruined Christmas. But how would you feel if your parents told you not to come home because your divorce might embarrass the family? I stayed quiet. I stayed gone. While they posed for photos under fake smiles, I was in the Rockies throwing a feast for 30 strangers who became my real family. The photos went viral. Golden lights, live jazz joy, they couldn't fake. Then came the 87 missed calls. Funny how silence always answers louder than words. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow fell in lazy spirals outside my kitchen window, blurring the edges of Denver's old brick houses into something out of a postcard. Inside, the smell of cinnamon candles mixed with cold air sneaking through the window frame. I was standing on a chair stringing a line of gold lights across the banister, pretending it was just another December. Pretending I didn't care that this Christmas would be the first without a family invitation. "Mom, can I put the angel on top?" Emma called from the living room, holding a paper angel with glitter all over her fingers. Her little brother, Jack, was chasing our cat underneath the half-decorated tree. "Not yet, sweetheart. We've still got a few more lights," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. My hands were cold, the plug kept slipping from my fingers. But I smiled anyway. That's what mothers do. Keep smiling even when the floor feels like it's shifting beneath you. Then my phone rang. The old landline, the one that still had a blinking red light whenever someone left a message. I climbed down, brushed the dust off my jeans, and pressed the speaker button. "Lena," my mother's voice said, crisp and careful, like she was delivering a public statement. "About Christmas dinner this year. Your father and I think it might be best if you sat this one out. Everyone's still adjusting to your situation, and we'd rather avoid any awkwardness. Please understand." A pause, then the faint clink of her teacup hitting the saucer. That sound had followed me through childhood, soft, proper, final. The message ended. For a moment I couldn't move. The garland slipped from my hand and fell to the floor, scattering tiny plastic holly leaves. The lights blinked across the wall like they were mocking me. I stared at the phone, at the little red light that had stopped flashing. And for some reason, all I could think was how quiet the house suddenly felt. "Mom." Emma's voice broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, her face half hidden by the glow from the tree. "What did Grandma say?" I swallowed, forcing my voice to sound calm. "Nothing important, honey. Just grown-up stuff." She frowned, sensing the lie, but too kind to press. "Can I keep coloring?" "Of course," I said softly. She disappeared back into the living room, humming Silent Night. The melody drifted through the hall, too sweet, too fragile. I picked up the fallen garland and tried to hang it again, but my hands trembled so badly, the lights slipped and tangled. I laughed under my breath, the kind of laugh that breaks in the middle. By the time the kids were in bed, the house had fallen into the hush that only winter nights carry. I poured a small glass of red wine, sat on the couch, and stared at the blinking lights. They blinked too fast, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. On the counter, the phone's voicemail light glowed solid red, waiting, accusing. I pressed delete. The recorded voice said, "Message erased." The words hit harder than I expected. For years, Christmas had been the same polished ritual. Matching sweaters, my mother's silver laid out just so. My father standing at the head of the table, carving the turkey with that practiced smile. And me, smiling, pretending, making sure the kids didn't spill cranberry sauce on the white linen. It wasn't a holiday. It was a production. A carefully edited photograph. And this year, I had been cropped out. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights painted the snow in soft amber. The world looked clean, untouched. I could see the reflection of the living room behind me, the half-decorated tree, the garland hanging crooked, my face pale in the glass. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her hair was tied up messily, her sweater had a stain near the cuff, but her eyes were awake in a way they hadn't been in years. "Huh," I whispered to my reflection. "Guess I ruined Christmas now." The silence after that felt peaceful. Strange, but peaceful. For the first time, no one was watching. No one was measuring my worth in dinner manners or marriage vows. I walked over to the banister again, picked up the strand of lights that had fallen earlier, and plugged it in. The bulbs flickered once, then glowed steady. Golden light spilled across the walls, catching in the glass ornaments and picture frames. Emma's drawing of a snowman family was taped crookedly beside an old photo of my parents at last year's Christmas dinner. Everyone in that photo was smiling. Everyone except me. I pulled it down and set it face down on the table. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady, relentless, erasing footprints smoothing out every rough edge. I could almost hear my mother's voice again, rehearsed and calm. Please understand. I wondered if she had any idea what those 2 words really meant. That understanding cuts both ways, that sometimes peace comes not from belonging, but from stepping away. I turned off the lights in the kitchen, leaving only the glow of the tree. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the cold. I leaned against the doorframe and whispered to no one. This Christmas, I'm not asking for a seat at their table. I'll build my own. Outside, the wind brushed against the window like a promise. The snow kept falling, and in that quiet, for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. The smell of pine and champagne still clung to my memory. When I think about that night in 2020, the last time I let myself believe in the illusion. The Bennett house looked like a magazine cover, every candle flickering in perfect rhythm. The kind of Christmas people post about online to prove they're happy. The camera crew from my father's office had been hired to film a family greeting for his campaign donors. My mother orchestrated everything right down to the angle of the tree and the boughs on the chairs. I remember her voice bright and polished, floating above the chatter. Our daughter Lauren is truly blessed. A wonderful husband, 2 perfect children. We couldn't be prouder. The guests nodded approvingly. Eric, standing beside me in his navy suit, flashed that charming smile he'd perfected in dental school. I smiled too. That was my job, to complete the picture. But as the photographer adjusted the lens, Eric's hand slipped into his pocket. His phone lit up. A quick glance, a smirk, and his thumb moved fast. I leaned slightly and caught it. The name Brittany. I kept smiling for the camera. Click. The flash went off. My stomach twisted. Later that night, while the house buzzed with laughter and music, I slipped into the kitchen to breathe. The air smelled like roasted turkey and sugar glaze. My hands shook as I washed a plate that didn't need washing. Then I heard his phone buzz again from the counter. The same name. I didn't need to open it. I already knew. There's a tone in a man's face when he's hiding something. When everyone had gone to bed, I logged into our joint account. Years of working as an interior designer had taught me to notice details, and something felt off about our finances. There it was, a series of transfers to a company I didn't recognize. I clicked the link. The website didn't exist. By the time Eric walked in, the glow from the screen painted my face ghostly white. "What's this?" I asked, turning the laptop toward him. He barely glanced at it. "Investments," he said, flatly loosening his tie. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I said. He sighed, impatient, like I was a child interrupting his story. "Lauren, not everything is a conspiracy. You've been stressed. Maybe take a break from the bookkeeping." I stood there, hands trembling. "You moved money out of our account, into something fake." He stepped closer, voice soft but cold. "You're overreacting. You always do. You sound like your mother when she's had too much wine." And then he smiled, that same polished smile he gave my parents. "You just have to trust me." "Okay. Keep the house running, look good for the family photos. Leave the business to me." He kissed my forehead like a doctor calming a patient. Then he walked away. I sat there until the house went quiet, staring at the bank screen, watching the cursor blink beside the zero balance. The next morning, I took the kids to my parents' house. The Bennett estate gleamed under the winter sun, its windows lined with white poinsettias. My mother opened the door in her cream sweater set, lipstick flawless. "Lauren's sweetheart," she said, kissing my cheek without touching it. "You look tired. Is everything all right with the children, Mom?" "I need to talk to you and Dad." I said, "It's about Eric." Her smile froze for a fraction of a second, then returned. "Of course. Come in." My father was in his office reading the Denver Journal with his glasses low on his nose. He didn't look up when I spoke. "He's been taking money," I said. "Thousands. Maybe more. I think it's fraud." Finally, he lowered the paper, but not out of shock. Out of irritation. "Lauren," he said, "you need to calm down. These things have explanations. And even if they don't, this isn't something we make public." "Public," I repeated. "I'm not worried about the neighbor's dad. I'm worried about being broke." He exhaled through his nose the way he did when a business deal went wrong. The last thing our family needs is gossip. Your mother's charity relies on donors who expect discretion. My mother appeared in the doorway holding a tray of tea. Richard's right, she said softly. Men make mistakes. What matters is how women handle them, with grace. She poured a cup, stirred once, twice. You have children to think of. Don't let pride ruin their future. I looked at her pearls, her perfect posture, her calmness like a blade. You're telling me to ignore it? She met my eyes. I'm telling you to preserve what you can. Something inside me cracked. You're both more worried about a headline than about me. My father didn't deny it. He just looked back at his paper. Go home, Lauren. We'll talk when you've had time to think rationally. I left without finishing the tea. Outside, the air was sharp cutting. The snow on their lawn was smooth, untouched. Like everything else in their world, it had to look perfect. When I got home, Eric was gone for the weekend on a conference. The kids were asleep. I sat by the tree, the same one we'd decorated as a family a few nights earlier. The ornaments glittered, reflecting my tired face in distorted fragments. All I could think was how much effort my family had spent on appearances, how my mother polished silver until it gleamed, how my father rehearsed smiles before every event. Everything had to shine, even if it was hollow. I picked up one of the ornaments, a glass sphere that mirrored the flickering lights. My reflection looked small inside it, trapped in the golden swirl. In that moment, I realized the truth that would carry me for years after. In our family, we never broke the glass. We just kept polishing it until we forgot the cracks were there. It was past midnight when I finally folded the last sweater into the suitcase. The apartment was half dark, lit only by the yellow glow from the kitchen. Jack was asleep on the couch, his little fists curled under his chin. Emma sat cross-legged beside him, hugging her stuffed penguin. "Mom," she whispered, "are we going on vacation?" "Something like that," I said, zipping the suitcase shut. A new start. I carried Jack to the car first, wrapping him in a blanket. Snow fell in thin white ribbons, the kind that sparkled under the streetlights. The air bit through my coat, sharp enough to sting, but I didn't care. I strapped him into the back seat, then took Emma's hand. She looked up at me with sleepy eyes, trusting completely the way only a child can. "Can we still have pancakes tomorrow?" she asked. "Always?" I said, forcing a smile. We drove away from the house on Pinecrest Avenue, the one I'd decorated to look like a life that wasn't mine anymore. I didn't look back. The headlights carved a path through the snow, the world behind me disappearing with each mile. By dawn, I was standing in the middle of our new home, a small apartment in the suburbs of Denver, with beige walls and a heater that rattled every few minutes. It smelled faintly of detergent and dust, the kind of place where no one would recognize my last name. I unpacked the essentials, brewed a cup of weak coffee, and watched Emma and Jack sitting on the carpet, piecing together a puzzle with missing corners. The sunlight creeping through the blinds painted their faces gold. My reflection stared back at me from the window, messy hair, hollow eyes, but something steadier beneath the exhaustion. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was performing. That afternoon, a knock sounded on the door. I hesitated before opening it. A woman stood there, maybe in her early 60s, with silver hair braided neatly over one shoulder and a Tupperware container in her hands. "You must be the new tenant," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Eleanor. I live next door. Figured you could use something homemade." Inside the container was apple pie still warm. The smell filled the kitchen instantly. "Thank you," I said. "That's very kind." She smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "We all start over here one way or another. Trust me. It gets better once you stop trying to make sense of it." I laughed softly. "That's good to know. Come by any time if you need help with the heater," she added. "It's stubborn, but so am I." After she left, I stood by the counter for a long time, the pie cooling beside me. Her words echoed in my head. We all start over here. Maybe I wasn't the only one rebuilding. The next morning, I called the law office Patricia Langford had recommended. The receptionist put me on hold, the kind of endless, tinny jazz that makes you second-guess everything. But when the line finally clicked, a voice came through. Steady, confident, unmistakably sure of itself. "Patricia Langford," she said. "How can I help you?" I hesitated, then said, "My name's Lauren Bennett. I need a divorce attorney, and probably a miracle." There was a brief pause, then a low chuckle. "Miracles are rare, Mrs. Bennett, but justice? That I can work with. Tell me what happened." By the time I finished talking, my throat was raw. She didn't interrupt once. When I stopped, she said, "He embezzled, didn't he?" "Yes. And you have proof I do." "Good," she said, calm and deliberate. "Then we're not starting from zero. We're starting from a position of power. You may not feel it yet, but you've already done the hardest part. You left." Her certainty steadied me. I made an appointment for later that week. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop. The heater hummed in protest as I scrolled through job listings, part-time design work, online freelancing, anything. I filled out applications, wrote polite cover letters, retyped my resume 3 times until my eyes blurred. When I couldn't type another word, I opened a blank email and started writing to myself, just a few sentences. "You're doing it. You're not broken, just bruised. Keep going." I saved it as a draft, like a note from someone braver than me. The apartment creaked around me, old pipes groaning in the walls. The heater clicked, then went quiet again. In that silence, I heard the sound of my own breathing, uneven but real. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It sneaks in quietly in the form of a cheap cup of coffee and a heater that won't quit, reminding you that you're still alive. A few days later, I sat across from Patricia in her office, watching the way she moved. Measured, composed her desk lined with stacks of case files. She pushed a legal pad toward me. "I'll need dates, amounts, anything you can remember." "The more precise, the stronger the case," I nodded. "I want it all back," I said. "Not just the money. Everything he tried to take from me." She studied me for a moment, then smiled almost approvingly. "Then let's begin." By the time I left her office, the snow was melting into slush, the sidewalks slick but glistening. I walked slowly to my car, breathing in the cold air that burned my lungs. It felt like the first honest breath I'd taken in years. That evening, I came home to find Eleanor waiting in the hallway, holding a mug of cocoa. "You survived the city," she teased. "Barely," I said, smiling. She looked past me into the apartment. "The kids doing okay?" "They are. I'm still figuring it out." "You will," she said, her tone so certain it made me believe her. "Give it time. Even cracked glass can catch light. Later." After she left, I sat by the window, watching the snowfall return. The reflection staring back at me wasn't polished or perfect, but it was mine. I reached up, unclasped my wedding ring, and placed it on the table beside the cooling mug of tea. Outside, snow blanketed the world in silence, soft and endless, erasing everything that came before. Patricia's office always smelled like coffee and paper. The walls were lined with framed degrees and photos of her standing beside people who looked both terrified and relieved. Clients who had survived the storm. A soft golden light from her desk lamp cut through the autumn haze outside, falling across a mountain of folders stacked like a fortress between us. She adjusted her glasses and said, "I found something." Her tone was even, but there was weight behind every word. "Your husband transferred money into an investment company that doesn't technically exist, but here's the strange part. That company has financial ties to the Bennett family trust. For a moment, I didn't understand. What?" "Your father's trust," she said gently. "It's not direct, but the trail connects through a subsidiary." I stared at her, feeling the room tilt slightly. "My father?" I asked. "You're saying he's involved?" "I'm not saying that yet." Patricia leaned forward, tapping a page with her pen. "I'm saying the money trail overlaps. Could be coincidence. Could be a cover. I'll need more time to confirm." I sat there, my pulse loud in my ears. The idea of Eric stealing from me had hurt, but the idea that my own father might be helping him, that was something else entirely. He'd never... I stopped myself, because I didn't actually know what my father would or wouldn't do. Patricia closed the file and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Lauren people protect what they think matters most. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's pride. Sometimes it's their own reflection. I left her office with a folder clutched to my chest, the autumn wind cutting across the parking lot. The air smelled of wet leaves and exhaust. My car's interior was freezing, but I didn't turn the heater on. I just sat there staring at the steering wheel, feeling that old familiar ache spread through me. The one that came every time I realized loyalty in my family was never mutual. By the time I reached the elementary school, the afternoon sky had turned gray. I watched Emma run toward me, her backpack bouncing. Her cheeks flushed from the cold. She waved so hard I almost forgot the conversation still replaying in my head. Mom, she called, climbing into the back seat. Guess what I got picked to draw the Thanksgiving poster for class? That's great, baby, I said, forcing a smile. You're my little artist. Jack held up a paper turkey made out of construction paper and glue. Mine has googly eyes, he said proudly. I laughed, the sound surprising even me. For a few seconds, the world was simple again, just school projects and sticky fingers. But as I drove home, Patricia's words whispered like an echo under the music on the radio. At dinner, I tried to be present. Emma told a long story about her teacher's cat, and Jack made faces with spaghetti noodles hanging from his mouth. I smiled, nodded, played my part. But when they went to bed, the silence of the apartment felt heavier than usual. Later that night, Eleanor knocked softly and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. She carried 2 mugs of tea and the familiar scent of cinnamon. I saw your lights on, she said. Figured you might need company. We sat by the small electric fireplace, the hum of the heater filling the spaces between words. I told her about the discovery, about the money, about my father's name in Patricia's files. She listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around the mug. That's a hard one, she said finally. Finding out the people who were supposed to protect you might be the ones you need protection from. I stared at the flames. It feels like I've been running in circles my whole life, trying to make them proud, trying to fit into whatever picture they wanted me to be in, but it was never enough. Eleanor smiled sadly. My husband used to say love is just a word people use when they want to own something. I didn't believe him then. I still don't, but I do know this. Sometimes the people who give us life aren't the ones who give us peace. She told me about losing her husband years ago, how grief had turned her quiet, but also kinder. After he passed, my own son stopped calling. Guess I reminded him too much of what he lost. It hurts like hell, but I'm still here. And so are you. Her words wrapped around me like the old quilt draped over her knees. I didn't realize I was crying until she reached over and squeezed my hand. You'll get through this, she said. Maybe not cleanly, maybe not gracefully, but you'll get through. I managed a weak smile. Thank you, Eleanor. I think I needed to hear that tonight. Good, she said, standing up. Now go get some rest. The world can wait until morning. After she left, I lingered by the fire, watching the flickering orange light dance against the walls. The apartment felt small, but safe. The kind of safe I hadn't known growing up. I thought about my parents' house, big, cold, echoing, and realized I didn't miss it. Not even a little. When I finally crawled into bed, Emma was already asleep beside Jack, her tiny hand resting on his shoulder. In the dim light, their faces looked peaceful. I pulled the blanket over them and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Mom, she murmured, without opening her eyes. Is Grandpa gonna help us now? The question caught in my throat. I smoothed her hair and whispered, It's okay, sweetheart. We can help ourselves. She smiled in her sleep, and I sat there for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing. Outside, the wind picked up sweeping dry leaves down the street. Somewhere across the city, my father was probably sitting in his study, polishing his cufflinks, pretending nothing was wrong. Maybe he believed that money could hide cracks in the glass. But as I lay there watching the shadows move across the ceiling, I realized something simple and terrifying. My family's picture-perfect frame had never been whole. It had been cracked for years. I just hadn't wanted to see the fractures. And now that I did, there was no way to unsee them. The room felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the fluorescent light bleeding across the polished wood table. Or maybe it was the way everyone avoided eye contact. I sat beside Patricia, hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. Across from us, Eric leaned back in his chair, confident as ever, his lawyer whispering something in his ear that made him smirk. Let's be adults about this, Eric said, his tone calm, practiced. We can settle this quietly, Lauren. No need to drag everyone's names through the mud, especially your family's. I stared at him, at the man I had once built a life around. The arrogance hadn't changed. The entitlement still sat on his shoulders like an expensive coat. Patricia didn't look up from her papers. Quietly, she repeated, flipping a page. That's one word for it. Eric's lawyer leaned forward. My client has already offered a fair settlement. Patricia cut him off, her voice sharp but steady. A fair settlement would require honesty, counselor. And your client hasn't been particularly generous with that. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick enough to make the table creak when she set it down. Here's what we call the truth. Eric's smirk faltered for the first time. Patricia opened the folder and slid several pages across the table. Bank records, she said, showing transfers from the joint account into a shell company. A company linked to a trust your father-in-law manages. And here, she tapped one page with a pen, is the signature confirming the transaction. Richard Bennett. My father's name hit the air like a dropped glass. The lawyer blinked, flipping through the pages quickly. This is circumstantial. Patricia didn't flinch. It's documented and verified. Unless your client would like to claim the signature was forged. Eric's face lost its color. For a moment, he looked almost human, vulnerable, frightened. Then the arrogance returned a brittle mask. Richard didn't know what I was doing. Don't drag him into this. Patricia smiled slightly. Oh, I'm not dragging him anywhere. The subpoena did that for me. At the end of the table, the door opened, and my father walked in. Richard Bennett. Impeccable as always in his gray suit, and the same silver tie he wore to every public event. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was seeing him clearly for the first time. The mediator cleared her throat. Mr. Bennett, please take a seat. He nodded stiffly and sat down without looking at me, his hands folded neatly on the table the way they used to when he lectured me about appearances. Mr. Bennett. Patricia began. You were listed as a guarantor for the trust that received funds from Mr. Hayes's account. Were you aware of these transactions? My father's jaw tightened. I was told they were business-related, routine. Did you verify that I didn't think I needed to? Patricia slid another document forward. These are emails between you and Mr. Hayes referencing the transfers as a way to cover short-term liquidity issues. Would you like me to read them aloud? His eyes flicked toward her, then to me, just for a heartbeat. And in that glance, I saw everything he wouldn't say. Shame, guilt, fear of being seen. The mediator's pen scratched against the paper. Let the record reflect that Mr. Bennett acknowledges the transactions were made under his authorization. Silence swallowed the room. Eric's lawyer whispered frantically to him, but it was useless. The evidence was too solid, the lies too tangled to untie. Patricia leaned back, calm as ever. I believe that concludes our review. The mediator nodded. Mr. Hayes, given these findings, the court recommends full restitution of misappropriated funds and equitable division of remaining assets. Eric opened his mouth, but Patricia raised a hand. Don't, she said quietly. Sometimes silence is the only smart move left. He shut his mouth. When the session adjourned, I stood slowly, my legs trembling. My father didn't look up. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he just gathered his coat and walked out the opposite door. The sound of it closing echoed like a verdict. Outside, snow was falling thick and heavy, blanketing downtown Denver in white. The wind cut through my coat, sharp against my face. Patricia handed me her umbrella, but I shook my head. I wanted to feel it. The cold, the sting, the clarity. She fell into step beside me as we walked toward the parking lot. You did well in there, she said. I didn't say much. Sometimes that's the point. You don't have to shout to reclaim your power. I stopped at my car, watching the snow pile up on the windshield. I don't even feel angry, I said. I thought I would, but I don't. Patricia studied me for a moment. What do you feel? Done, I said simply, like a door just closed and I'm not supposed to open it again. She smiled faintly. That's what freedom sounds like. I opened the car door and the heater blasted a puff of stale air. Before I got in, she touched my arm. You can leave this city now, Lauren. You don't owe anyone anything anymore. Not money, not silence, not guilt. I nodded. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. I just don't want to live in their lies anymore. Patricia squeezed my arm once, then turned back toward the courthouse. Her figure disappeared into the swirl of snow, leaving me standing alone in the white noise of the storm. When I slid into the driver's seat, the world outside looked like it had been erased. The windshield fogged as I turned on the defroster. In the rearview mirror, I could see the car seats. Emma's pink backpack, Jack's little stuffed bear, both waiting for me at home. I rested my head against the steering wheel for a long time, listening to the steady hum of the engine and the soft thud of snow hitting the glass. Outside, the courthouse doors closed behind me, sealing in everything I was finally free from. When I opened my eyes again, the storm had calmed. The sky hung low and gray, but the snow sparkled faintly under the streetlights, clean and new. For the first time, I believed I could build something different, something real. And when I drove away, I didn't look back. The road to Aspen wound like a ribbon through the mountains, every turn cutting deeper into the white silence. Snow covered everything, trees, fences, even the warning signs along the roadside. The kids pressed their faces to the car windows, their breath fogging the glass. "Are we almost there?" Emma asked for the 5th time, her voice filled with the same mix of excitement and disbelief I felt. "Almost," I said, gripping the wheel, as another gust of snow swept across the windshield. Eleanor, sitting in the passenger seat, sipped from her thermos and smiled. "You're really doing it, Lauren," she said. "You're driving straight into your new life." I smiled back. "Feels like it's about time." When we finally turned off the main road, the world opened up. There it was. The house. A stone mansion that had been left to the mercy of the mountains, its roof draped in snow, windows blank and waiting. The real estate agent's car was already parked out front. A single trail of tire marks behind it. I stepped out of the car boots, sinking into fresh powder. The cold bit my cheeks, but the air was so pure it almost stung to breathe. Emma and Jack ran ahead, their laughter echoing in the open air. The house looked tired, but proud, standing against the wind like an old soldier who refused to fall. Its wide veranda overlooked a valley of endless white. Eleanor came up beside me, her breath visible in the chill. "She's a beauty," she said softly. I nodded, feeling something in my chest loosen. "We're going to make this home." When I signed the papers an hour later, the pen trembled in my hand, not from fear, but from awe. The contract felt less like ownership and more like permission. Permission to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of me I'd buried under years of pretending. The kids raced from room to room as I followed behind, making mental lists, floors to polish, windows to fix, walls to paint. The place was a mess, peeling wallpaper dust thick enough to write our names in. But it was ours. That first week we lived on takeout and determination. I scrubbed floors until my hands blistered painted walls in shades of cream, and sage hung curtains that fluttered softly with every draft. I used salvaged furniture from thrift stores and estate sales, wood tables with scars, mismatched chairs that somehow belonged together. Eleanor came every morning with coffee and rolled-up sleeves. "You're going to owe me a back massage when this is over," she joked as we carried bookshelves up the stairs. "Deal," I said, laughing for the first time in weeks. By the end of the month, the old stone house had a pulse again. I set up a small art studio in the basement, bare concrete floors, paint-stained easels, a long wooden table I found at a flea market. It smelled like turpentine and promise. I started offering weekend classes for local kids, charging just enough to cover supplies. They came shy and quiet at first, but within a few weeks, the room was filled with color and laughter. Emma painted snow angels. Jack drew dragons breathing ice instead of fire. At night, when the kids were asleep, I worked on something bigger. A proposal for an art retreat, a place where people could come to paint, write, and remember themselves. I titled it Summit Haven Retreat. The name felt right. A place high above the noise where silence wasn't loneliness, but space to begin again. One evening, I sat by the window while the last light faded behind the peaks. The sky was streaked with gold and lavender, and the snow below shimmered like glass. I whispered to myself, silence isn't so scary anymore. It's just the sound of life catching its breath. In Denver, a different kind of silence was breaking. My mother sat in her living room, the same room where she'd once announced family dinners like royal decrees. Across from her, my father read the newspaper headline folded in half. The article was about me. Divorced designer rebuilds life in Aspen Mountains. The accompanying photo showed the house snow-covered and radiant. She's turning her failure into a brand, my mother snapped, slamming the magazine onto the table. "Look at this. She's being called inspirational. For leaving her husband." My father didn't look up. "People love a redemption story." Margaret's voice rose sharp and brittle. "She's humiliating us." He finally met her eyes. "Maybe she stopped living for us." Back in Aspen, I didn't know about the article or the storm brewing in Denver. I only knew the quiet rhythm of this new life. The hiss of the radiator, the crunch of snow under boots, the creak of old floorboards settling into warmth again. Eleanor taught the kids how to bake apple cobbler, while I spent my evenings sketching designs for the retreat brochure. On weekends, locals came by to see the progress. "You've done wonders with this place," one of them said, standing in the great room, now painted soft ivory. "It feels alive again. That night, I lit the fireplace for the first time. The chimney groaned, then the flames caught, throwing amber light across the stone walls. Emma and Jack curled up on the rug with mugs of cocoa, their faces glowing in the firelight. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, humming softly to herself. I watched the flames dance and thought about everything that had burned away in the last 2 years, marriage reputation certainty. What was left was smaller, simpler, but real. Emma looked up at me, her voice drowsy. "Mom, is this really home now?" I nodded. "It is, sweetheart. This is the start of our story." She smiled, eyelids drooping, and fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder. I threw another log into the fire and sat back, the warmth soaking through my bones. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless, blanketing the world in silence. The flames reflected in the glass window beside me, casting my face in flickering gold. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing in the ruins of my old life. I was standing at the beginning of something new. Denver had always loved a good scandal, and by early 2023, my name had become one. Every social circle that once adored the Bennett family now whispered about us over glasses of Chardonnay. I didn't hear it firsthand. I was 200 miles away in a mountain town that smelled of pine and wood smoke. But the stories still found their way to me. "Did you see the article?" Patricia asked one morning over the phone. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was trying to prepare me. "They're investigating the heritage fund your father manages. Apparently some of the missing donations trace back to Eric's transfers." I set my coffee down slowly. "He's going to lose his seat on the council, isn't he?" "Looks that way," she said. "I just thought you should hear it from me, not the news." For a moment, I felt nothing. No shock, no satisfaction, just a quiet exhale, like the end of a long-held breath. In Aspen, life didn't stop for anyone's downfall. My days were filled with meetings at the local bank where Linda Carpenter, the branch director, became both ally and teacher. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had a way of explaining business loans like she was teaching art composition. "You can't build freedom on guesswork," she told me during one of our meetings. "Know every number before you sign." That's how men get away with things. They count on women not reading the fine print. I smiled, taking notes. I've learned that lesson the hard way. With Linda's help, the Summit Haven retreat started to take shape. We secured funding to renovate the East Wing into guest suites, ordered supplies from local vendors, and hired a small staff, housekeepers, a chef, a maintenance crew. For the first time, I had a payroll to meet a budget to balance, and a reason to wake up at dawn that didn't involve fear. Most mornings, I walked down to the main hall before sunrise, coffee in hand, to check on the progress. The sound of hammering echoed through the empty corridors, and the smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. The building that had once been a ruin was turning into something alive again. Eleanor helped where she could, folding laundry in the evenings, baking cookies for the construction crew. Emma and Jack built snow forts outside after school, their laughter echoing through the valley. Some nights I sat by the fireplace, the kids asleep upstairs, the quiet pressing in like a warm blanket. That's when the emails from Patricia usually came, updates about the case, about Denver, about how my father's name had finally surfaced in the investigation. One night, I opened my laptop to see the subject line, "Suspension confirmed." The message was short. "Richard Bennett has been removed from the city council, pending full inquiry into the misuse of charitable funds. Margaret is attempting to handle PR, but the donors are pulling away." I stared at the screen for a long time, the fire crackling beside me. Karma doesn't knock when you're waiting for it. It shows up quietly when you've stopped needing it to. I closed the laptop and leaned back, watching the snow fall outside. For years, my parents had been untouchable, an empire built on etiquette and perception. Now the cracks were visible to everyone, and the only thing left standing was the truth they'd buried. Meanwhile, in Denver, the same truth was clawing its way through the glittering shell of the Heritage Circle. My mother arrived at the charity luncheon she'd once chaired, her pearls catching the light as she forced a smile. But as soon as she entered the room, the whispers started. "I heard the investigation isn't just about Eric." One woman murmured to another, "They say Richard's trust is involved. Do you think Lauren's resort is a front?" Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted her glass. "Gossip," she said lightly, but her voice cracked. "My daughter simply wanted a change of scenery." The women smiled politely, the kind of smiles that cut more than words. By the time the luncheon ended, Margaret's seat at the head table felt colder than the snow outside. That night, she returned home to find the house dark. Richard was sitting in his office, the curtains drawn. The phone on his desk vibrated again and again. Calls from investors, messages from donors. He didn't answer any of them. She stepped closer. "Richard," she said softly. "Say something." He didn't look up. "What do you want me to say?" "That this isn't our fault," she whispered. "That she dragged us into this." He rubbed his temples. "Maybe she didn't drag us anywhere. Maybe we did this to ourselves." Margaret froze, unable to respond. The silence between them was thicker than years of polite conversation could ever fill. Back in Aspen, I woke early to the sound of wind pushing against the windows. The mountains were blanketed in new snow, and the valley below shimmered like a sea of light. I walked down to the main hall where the renovation team had just finished hanging the final chandelier. The crystals caught the morning sun and threw 100 tiny rainbows across the walls. For a moment, I just stood there surrounded by color and warmth, listening to the hum of new beginnings. Eleanor joined me holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Looks like it's finally coming together," she said. "It is," I said quietly. "Everything's starting to make sense." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "You're not thinking about them again, are you?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe a little." "Old habits. Let it go," she said, setting her mug down. "Some storms clean the air before the sky can clear." I turned toward the window where the snow was still falling in soft waves. My reflection looked steadier now, someone who had built something with her own hands, someone who didn't need validation to feel whole. That night, while Emma and Jack slept under heavy quilts, I wrote the final version of my retreat proposal, signing my name at the bottom with a steady hand. Outside, the world was silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. Somewhere far away, my parents' empire was crumbling. But here in the quiet heart of the mountains, something entirely different was being built. Something honest. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a Bennett at all. I felt like myself. The December light in Aspen had a way of turning everything gold. Even the snow looked warmer under it, glowing against the dark pine trees that surrounded Summit Haven. The house had never looked more alive. Wreaths hung from every door, strings of amber lights curled up the staircase, and the smell of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Emma stood on a stool, carefully hanging a paper star on the banister, while Jack untangled a mess of lights that looked beyond saving. "Mom," he said, frowning, "this one's broken. Then we fix it." I said, crouching beside him, "Nothing's too far gone." He grinned and went back to work. It had been almost 2 years since I'd bought the house, but this Christmas felt different. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about creating something new, something that belonged to us. The great hall shimmered under the soft light from the chandelier. I had spent the past week writing and rewriting my guest list on the back of an old grocery receipt. At the top of the page, in careful handwriting, I'd titled it, "A Christmas of Second Chances." 30 names. Some were new friends, neighbors, employees, local artists I'd met through the retreat. Others were women I'd met at support groups in Denver, women rebuilding their own lives. I wanted to fill the house with people who understood what it meant to start over. Eleanor came down the stairs holding a box of ornaments, her gray braid tucked under a red knit hat. "You know," she said, "I've lived through 62 Christmases, and this might be the first one I'm actually excited for." I smiled. "That makes 2 of us." She placed the box on the table. "How's the guest list coming full?" I said. "But not too full." She raised an eyebrow. "And your parents?" I hesitated, untangling another set of lights. "Not this year." Her look softened. "Maybe that's for the best." Before I could answer, Emma's voice called from across the room. "Mom, are we inviting Grandma?" I froze for just a second too long. "Not this year, sweetheart," I said finally. "We're doing something a little different this time." Emma looked disappointed. "But maybe next year, maybe." I said quietly, "We'll see." Eleanor caught my eye and gave a small nod. No judgment, just understanding. The next morning I drove into town to meet with the florist and the jazz trio I'd hired for the night. The florist, a woman named Natalie, helped me choose golden ribbons and winter roses, arranging them in tall glass vases that shimmered when the light hit them. The band rehearsed in the corner of the cafe, their saxophone melting into the hum of espresso machines. When I returned home, the snow had started falling again, heavy and slow. The house looked like something out of a storybook. Inside, the fire crackled, and the kids were stringing popcorn garlands in front of the fireplace. Eleanor handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You've created something special here, you know. Not just the house, the feeling. I looked around at the laughter, the light, the small chaos of it all. I hope so. As night settled over the valley, the sky turned the color of copper. I sat by the window with Eleanor, both of us wrapped in blankets, watching the snowflakes blur against the glass. The only sound was the faint pop of the fire. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked gently. I didn't need to ask who she meant. Sometimes I admitted. But less now. It's strange. There was a time I couldn't stop replaying what they said, what they did. Now it's like those voices belong to someone else's life. She smiled. Maybe because they do. I turned toward her. "This Christmas will be different." "Yes," she said softly. "It'll be the first one that's really yours." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the house glowing around us. I could feel the warmth of everything we'd built, the safety, the quiet, the hope. The following afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a man standing in the snow camera, slung over his shoulder, a notepad in hand. "Lauren Bennett," he asked, smiling. "Alex Monroe Aspen Daily. I heard about your event this weekend. Mind if I take a few photos?" I hesitated, glancing at the camera. "It's not really a press thing, just a small gathering." He nodded, his breath clouding in the cold. "I get that, but your story's already making waves in town. A woman building a retreat for second chances. It's inspiring. People could use a little hope this season." I laughed quietly. "You sure that's what they'll see?" "I think so," he said. "Mind if I step inside?" I led him to the main hall. The smell of pine and vanilla filled the air. The massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, its gold ornaments reflecting the flicker of the fire. Alex's eyes widened. "Wow," he said. "This place looks like a dream." He took a few photos, the tree, the wreaths, the soft light spilling through the windows. Then he turned the lens toward me. "Tell me about the name," he said. "A Christmas of Second Chances." Why that I looked at the tree, at the reflection of my children laughing across the room. "Because everyone deserves one," I said. "Even the people who think they don't." He lowered the camera, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good answer." When he left, the snow was falling thicker, muffling the sound of his car as it disappeared down the mountain road. I stood on the porch for a moment, the cold brushing against my skin, the world glowing gold behind me. Inside, Emma and Jack were still decorating the lower branches of the tree, their laughter filling the house. Eleanor adjusted the ribbons and hummed along to the faint jazz coming from the speakers. I took a deep breath, the scent of pine and warmth settling around me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was trying to prove anything. To anyone. The house gleamed under the soft light, the snow piling high outside, and I realized that everything I'd lost had quietly led me here, to this golden moment, this stillness. And as the firelight danced across the walls, it felt like the house itself was breathing again, alive, and ready for whatever came next. The house glowed like a lantern against the snow. From the road below, Summit Haven must have looked like a golden flame flickering in the valley. I stood in the doorway as the first guests arrived, the cold air rushing in with them. Laughter, footsteps, the jingle of scarves and wine bottles. The jazz trio near the fireplace was already warming up, the sound of the saxophone rolling through the halls like a heartbeat. Lauren Eleanor called from the staircase, her red dress catching the light. "They're coming in faster than we can take their coats. I'll handle it," I said, laughing as I moved toward the foyer. The night filled with motion. Friends from town. Artists from the retreat. A few of the women I'd met during that long, broken year in Denver. They all came through the door, shaking snow from their boots. Eyes wide at the sight of the tree that touched the ceiling. Its branches shimmered with gold ribbons, the ornaments casting reflections that danced across the walls. Everyone brought something. A homemade pie. A bottle of red wine, a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. I didn't need any of it, but somehow each offering made the house feel warmer, more alive. Emma and Jack darted through the crowd like snowflakes caught in wind. Emma wore a white dress with a tiny gold belt, her curls bouncing as she ran. Jack, determined to help, carried a tray of gingerbread cookies to every guest. "Be careful," I warned as he nearly collided with the pianist. He grinned up at me, a smear of icing on his cheek. "Don't worry, Mom. I got this." Eleanor took the tray from him and laughed. "I'll supervise before the guests end up wearing their dessert." By 7, the house was full. Music drifted from the grand room into the halls. Someone popped open a bottle of champagne, and the cork hit the ceiling before landing in a bowl of ornaments. Everyone cheered. I moved through the crowd, greeting, laughing, losing track of time. Every room pulsed with color. The red of wine, the gold of firelight, the silver gleam of glasses raised in toasts. I had never seen so many different lives overlap so easily. No one cared about status or scandal or what name was printed on the invitation. Halfway through the night, Eleanor tapped her glass with a spoon. The chatter quieted, and the soft hum of the saxophone filled the gap. She raised her drink and said, "For those of us who were told we didn't belong and still found a way to love anyway, Merry Christmas to the ones who stayed." The room went still for a heartbeat. Then applause broke out loud and genuine. People lifted their glasses high, eyes shining in the candlelight. I felt my throat tighten as I looked around. This wasn't just a party. It was proof that something beautiful could rise from the ashes. I whispered almost to myself, "This is what family feels like." Alex Monroe, the journalist from Aspen. Daly stood near the fireplace, camera in hand. I caught him watching quietly, not intruding, just observing. When our eyes met, he smiled before raising the lens again. The flash went off, and for an instant the whole room glowed even brighter. Later, while the band played a slow, smoky version of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, I stepped out onto the veranda for air. The cold bit through my dress, but the valley stretched beneath me like a sea of stars. From inside, laughter spilled through the open door, soft, real, alive. Alex joined me a few minutes later, camera slung over his shoulder. "It's beautiful," he said. "The view, I mean. Though the party's not bad either." "Thank you," I said, exhaling a cloud of white. "It's the first Christmas that actually feels like Christmas." He looked at me curiously. "So why call it a Christmas of second chances?" I smiled, eyes still on the horizon, because everyone deserves one, even people who think they've already lost everything. He nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Mind if I use that in the article?" "Go ahead," I said. "It's true." When the last guests began to leave, the snow had started falling again. Soft flakes catching in the golden light of the windows. Emma had fallen asleep on Eleanor's lap, and Jack was curled up by the fireplace, his little hand still clutching a candy cane. I walked the final guests to the door, exchanging hugs and promises to visit again. Alex was the last to leave. Before stepping outside, he handed me his card. "I'll send you some of the photos tomorrow," he said. "Your story, it deserves to be seen." After the door closed, I turned off the music, the silence filling the space where laughter had been. The room looked different now, quiet, glowing, perfect in its stillness. Picked up an empty glass from the mantel, set it down, and stood for a while just watching the fire shrink into embers. When my phone buzzed, it was from Alex. A handful of images appeared, me standing beside the golden tree, Emma dancing Eleanor's toast, frozen mid-laugh. At the end, there was one photo that made me stop. It was me. Alone in the crowd, standing beneath the chandelier, the light wrapping around me like a halo. My expression wasn't one of pride or revenge. It was peace. Beneath the photo, he'd written, "I'll post this in tomorrow's edition. Some stories tell themselves." I set the phone down, heart full in a way I hadn't felt for years. The snow outside pressed gently against the windows, whispering against the glass. Miles away in Denver, my mother sat in her living room, scrolling through her tablet. Her manicure was flawless, her glass of wine untouched. The glow of the screen reflected on her face as she stopped at the photo. The golden house, the laughter, me smiling, as if the world had never broken me. Her breath caught. The wine glass wobbled in her hand before she set it down too quickly. She stared at the image at her daughter, surrounded by strangers who looked like they belonged more than she ever had. The edges of her smile trembled, then disappeared entirely. Outside her window, snow began to fall again. Silent, relentless, erasing everything it touched. Sunlight spilled across the floor, pale gold, reflecting off the snow outside. For a moment, I didn't remember what day it was. Just that the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a night full of laughter. The faint smell of waffles drifted from the kitchen, and I could hear Emma humming to herself, off-key, and happy. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a list of missed calls. 87. Everyone from the same number. Mom. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The tiny red numbers blinked like a heartbeat. Then I set the phone face down on the bedspread and let the silence settle again. When I finally went downstairs, sunlight was pouring through the windows, turning the frost on the glass into a sheet of gold. Eleanor was already at the stove, flipping waffles with her usual calm precision. Jack was sitting at the table, covered in powdered sugar, while Emma twirled in the living room, still in her pajamas. "Merry Christmas, sleepyhead," Eleanor said, glancing over her shoulder. "Merry Christmas," I said softly, leaning against the doorway. "You got the whole town talking last night," she said, nodding toward my phone on the counter. "Your story's everywhere." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She handed me a folded newspaper, the Aspen Daily. Right there on the front page above the fold was a photo of me standing under the golden tree, smiling at someone just out of frame. The headline read, "The Christmas She Built Alone." I sank into the chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. The article was long, but I didn't need to read much to understand. Alex had written it beautifully, about how I'd rebuilt my life in the mountains, about the people I'd invited to the dinner, about the idea that family could be chosen. There was a photo of Emma and Jack laughing beside the tree of Eleanor, raising her glass mid-toast. Underneath, the comments poured in, thousands of them. "She's the definition of resilience." This made me cry, in the best way. I left my marriage last year. Her story gives me hope. This is what Christmas should feel like. I didn't realize I was smiling until Eleanor touched my arm. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just overwhelmed, I guess." The phone buzzed again. Another call from Denver. I silenced it without looking. "Let them talk," I whispered. I poured myself coffee and walked to the window. The snow was still falling soft and slow, coating the pines in white. The sunlight caught each flake like a spark. Somewhere below the ridge, a car door slammed, then faded into quiet again. Behind me, the kids were arguing about syrup, their laughter spilling through the house. It was messy, warm, real. Everything I'd wanted. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was performing. Meanwhile, in Denver, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to the same article. The cursor blinked at the top of the screen, where her search bar still read, "Lauren Bennett Aspen." The morning light through the curtains hit her face, but she didn't notice. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. "Look at her," she whispered. The photo showed me laughing, surrounded by people she didn't know. My house, my children, my joy. None of it needed her approval. Richard entered quietly, holding a mug of coffee. His voice was low. "You've been sitting here since dawn." She didn't answer. He walked closer, scanning the screen over her shoulder. His eyes lingered on the headline, then the photo. "They're not talking about us anymore," he said finally. His voice cracked a little. "They're talking about her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "She humiliated us," she said, softly, almost pleading. "Our friends are calling, asking questions. They think she's some kind of saint." Richard set his mug down. Maybe she just stopped pretending. She turned sharply. "Don't start." "I'm not," he said. "But maybe this isn't about her hurting us. Maybe it's about you missing what people used to say when they looked at you." Her eyes filled anger and confusion tangled into one. "You think I care about gossip?" "I think you care about being admired," he said gently. "And now the world's admiring someone else." For a moment she said nothing. Then she closed the laptop too hard, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. She stared at her reflection in the dark screen, the faint outline of a woman who had spent her whole life curating perfection, and had just watched it crumble. Up in Aspen, I carried my coffee to the porch. The cold hit my face sharp and clean. The world stretched endlessly before me. White valleys, golden sunlight, the faint shimmer of the frozen lake below. My breath came out in soft clouds. I thought about the calls I hadn't answered, the years I'd spent chasing their approval. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I just felt free. Behind me, Emma pushed open the door. "Mom, come eat before Jack finishes all the waffles. I'm coming," I said, smiling. She ran back inside, leaving the door cracked open. Warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of butter and syrup. I stood there for one more moment, the snow glowing pale gold around me. Inside that house, I had built something small but real. And outside, somewhere beyond the mountains, the people who once defined me were realizing they no longer could. In Denver, Margaret sat motionless, her hands pressed to her temples. The silence in the house felt different now. Hollow, unfamiliar. For the first time in her life, no one was calling her. No invitations, no praise, no sympathy, only the sound of her own breathing. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't move. He whispered, "Maybe this is what peace looks like for her." Margaret's voice broke as she answered, "Then why does it feel like punishment for me?" She lowered her head to the table, her pearls slipping loose around her neck. The sound of them scattering against the hardwood echoed through the room. And for the first time, Margaret Bennett understood what it meant to be unseen. The first week of January arrived quiet and white. Snow covered everything: the porch, the pines, the long driveway leading down to the road. The holiday decorations still clung to the house, a few gold ribbons fluttering in the cold wind. I was taking down the tree in the great room, untangling strands of lights, when I heard the crunch of tires outside. At first I thought it might be a delivery truck, but when I looked through the frosted window, my heart stalled. A silver sedan sat idling at the gate, its headlights cutting through the snow. For a moment I couldn't move. Then the door opened and my mother stepped out. She was smaller than I remembered, or maybe the mountains made everyone look small. Wrapped in a heavy fur coat, she paused at the bottom of the steps, one gloved hand clutching her purse as if it could steady her. I opened the door, cold air rushing in. Neither of us spoke at first. The wind carried our breath into clouds between us. Finally, she said, "You live high up here." I nodded. "It's quiet." Her eyes swept over the porch, the lights, the wreath still hanging on the door. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I didn't expect it to be so alive." I crossed my arms, unsure what to say. "Why are you here, Mom?" She hesitated, the question catching her. "I needed to see you. I needed to say something before I lose the chance." I let the screen door fall shut behind me and stepped out into the snow. The air bit at my cheeks. "You could have called," I said. She smiled weakly. 87 times wasn't enough. A flash of memory crossed my mind. The missed calls, the silence that followed. I shook my head. That wasn't calling to talk. That was calling to erase guilt. For a moment she looked like she might deny it. Then her shoulders sank. "Maybe you're right," she said. "I didn't come here to make excuses. I came because I finally understand what I did." The wind stirred between us, sending flakes swirling around her coat. She looked fragile the way porcelain looks right before it cracks. "I spent my whole life trying to be admired," she continued. "And when that was gone, I didn't know who I was anymore. You think I cared about reputation, but it wasn't that simple. Every compliment, every headline. It was how I measured worth. And when you walked away, I felt like I'd lost the last thing that made me matter." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. She never did. I swallowed hard. "You didn't lose me because of what I did, Mom. You lost me because you only saw what I could give your image. You didn't notice what it cost me." Her eyes met mine, glossy and searching. "And what did it cost you?" "My peace," I said quietly. "You told me to keep the family name clean, to smile no matter what happened behind closed doors, but pretending almost broke me. I thought silence was grace, but it was just fear dressed as loyalty." She took a step closer, the snow crunching under her boots. "You think I don't know what fear feels like," she said softly. "You have no idea what I've lost." I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You lost your reflection, and I lost my sense of safety. We both gave up too much for the same lie." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind died, leaving only the sound of snow slipping from the trees. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box wrapped in gold paper. She set it on the stone railing between us. "This isn't an apology," she said. "It's just something I kept. I thought you should have it." She turned to go, but curiosity rooted me. I unwrapped the paper carefully, my breath fogging in the cold. Inside was a framed photograph. Me, maybe 6 years old, holding a sparkler in the backyard of our old house. My smile was wide, unguarded. On the back, in her handwriting, were 5 words. "You always had light in you." My throat tightened. "Mom." I called, but she was already walking down the path toward the gate, her figure blurring in the falling snow. She didn't turn around, not once. I stood there, the picture trembling in my hands, until the sound of the car engine faded into silence. When I finally went back inside, the fire was burning low. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her expression soft and knowing. Was that who I think it was? I nodded, setting the box on the table. She came to say something. I think it was goodbye. Eleanor walked closer, her slippers silent against the wood floor. She rested a hand on my shoulder. "Forgiveness doesn't mean you let them back in, honey. It just means you stop carrying their weight. I looked down at the photo again, the little girl with the sparkler, glowing against the dark. I know. I whispered, and I think I'm ready. Eleanor smiled, her eyes warm. Good. Then you can finally start living for real. I leaned into her touch, the warmth of her hand grounding me. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it didn't sound lonely. It sounded clean, like something being swept away. Later that night, when the house was still and the moonlight spilled across the snow, I set the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. The girl in the picture beamed up at me, fearless bright. For the first time, I smiled back. Through the window, I could still see faint tire tracks leading down the mountain road. But the snow was falling faster now, covering them inch by inch, until the world was clean again. Morning light spilled across the valley, soft and golden painting, every ridge of the mountains in warmth. The world outside my window looked untouched, fresh snow glittering on the branches, the air so clear, it felt like breathing for the first time. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, my hands cupped around a mug of coffee, watching Emma and Jack chase each other through the drifts. Their laughter carried through the cold airlight and effortless. Inside, I could hear Eleanor moving around the kitchen, humming to herself as the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolled out through the open door. Every sound in this house had changed meaning. Even the creak of the old floors felt like home now. The phone buzzed beside me, breaking the quiet. I almost didn't answer, not wanting to disturb the stillness, but when I saw Patricia's name flash across the screen, I smiled. "Morning," I said. Her voice was bright, a rare kind of excitement in her usually steady tone. "Lauren, I wanted to call you myself. It's official. The state approved your license for Summit Haven Retreat this morning. You're fully registered." For a second, I couldn't speak. I just stared out at the sunlight glittering off the snow. "You're serious." "As serious as it gets," she said. "You did it. You actually did it." I laughed softly, the sound catching in my throat. "I didn't think I'd get here. You built something real," Patricia said. "Something that's yours. And for what it's worth, it's rare to see someone win without needing to destroy everything in their path." Her words sank in. "I didn't need them to lose," I said quietly. "I just needed peace. Then I'd say you've already won." We said our goodbyes, and I set the phone down beside me. The wind picked up, sending a soft ripple across the blanket of snow that covered the field. Emma's laughter echoed again as she tried to roll the start of a snowman, while Jack pelted her with snowballs from behind a tree. For a long moment I just watched them, 2 small reminders of everything worth keeping. The storm had passed, but its lesson lingered. Peace wasn't what came after the fight. It was what you built in the middle of it. Inside, Eleanor appeared in the doorway holding a tray with more coffee. "You're up early," she said, setting it down beside me. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "It's too beautiful out here." She followed my gaze to the mountains. "The world looks different when you stop waiting for someone to hand it back to you, doesn't it?" I smiled. "It really does." She patted my shoulder and went back inside. The door closed softly behind her, leaving only the sound of wind and the quiet rhythm of my own heartbeat. I pulled out my notebook from the small table by the chair. The pages were wrinkled and smudged with coffee stains, but it had carried me through everything. The fear, the anger, the rebuilding. I flipped to the last page and wrote slowly, "Peace isn't a destination. It's a way of living." The words came easily this time, without hesitation or doubt. When I looked up, the sun had climbed higher, its light spilling through the pines, melting the frost from the porch rail. Tiny drops fell like glass beads onto the snow below. I stepped down into the yard, boots sinking into the soft powder. The tree from Christmas still stood near the porch, its golden ribbons fluttering faintly in the wind. I hadn't been able to take it down yet, and now I didn't want to. It looked right here, simple, luminous, defiant against the cold. Emma saw me and waved her cheeks flushed pink. "Mom, come play." I laughed, shaking my head. "You two are unstoppable." Jack grinned and shouted, "We're winning the snowball war." "Then I surrender," I said, raising my hands. They ran toward me, breathless and giggling, and I pulled them both into a hug. The air was sharp, but the warmth between us was enough. Behind us, the house shimmered in the sunlight, its windows glowing gold against the white. For the first time I realized I didn't feel the weight of my family's shadow anymore. The world they built was gone, and that was all right. Some things have to fall apart so that others can stand stronger. Eleanor joined us a few minutes later, holding 3 mugs of hot cocoa. "You 3 look like a postcard," she said, smiling as she handed one to each of the kids. Maybe it's time we stop posing for someone else's camera, I said. This one's just for us. She nodded. That's how you know you've healed. The wind softened, carrying the faint sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves. It was the sound of winter giving way to something new. I turned back toward the porch where the golden tree still caught the light. The ribbons fluttered like small flames, refusing to fade. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to prove my worth, through silence, through suffering, through perfection, and how none of it had brought me peace. Peace had come the moment I stopped performing, the moment I stopped asking to be seen. The sun climbed higher, bright enough that the whole valley seemed to glow. Emma pointed toward the horizon. Mom, look, the snow's melting on the roof. We stood there together, the three of us, watching tiny streams of water trickle down the shingles, catching sunlight as they fell. The light hit their faces. Gold on white, and for once there was no noise, no fear, no unfinished business. Just calm. I closed my eyes and let the warmth settle deep in my chest. The best revenge, I realized, isn't anger or success. It's peace, living so fully that no one's absence feels like a wound anymore. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was brighter, the snow glittering like glass, and the mountains stood tall behind us, unchanged, but not untouched. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel small, don't waste your life proving them wrong. Let your peace prove it for you, because peace, that quiet golden kind, is the truest light of justice.